Sometimes the quiet in a hangar feels like an accusation, and the silence asks, "What have you done with your courage?" These rockets make promises to the sky that the ground has not yet kept to its people. I think of Martin Luther King Jr. in that hush, not because he would have liked rockets, he would have regarded them correctly as tools, but because he was conducting a different kind of launch. He launched conscience. He was an engineer of moral motion. He took the physics of society and rewired the logic that made injustice feel inevitable. He wrote firmware for the human heart, and he deployed it onto the broad architecture of a nation. We remember the phrase "I have a dream" as if it's a lyric that belongs to nostalgia. We clip it, post it, quote it at graduations and parades, and then we go back to optimizing viral attention and market share. But the dream was never meant to be a souvenir. It was a specification. Think about that for a second. A man standing in August of 1963, amid heat and dust and the slow thunder of too many questions, describing an operating system for justice. He defined inputs and outputs for society, dignity as a required feature, voting access as an API, equality as system integrity. He gave us a blueprint in plain speech, and then he tested it against brutality. That is what made him dangerous. Not the charm of his oratory, though it was brilliant, but that he proposed a method for social design that could be validated. Nonviolence was not passivity. It was an algorithm. It had states, preconditions, and expected results. Face hatred with love. Transform violence into revelation. Convert the energy of oppression into the clarity of conscience. It is elegant and terrifying. It says, systems can be changed if you change the operators. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and mention where you are watching from in the comments. When I was building rockets, I learned a different kind of terror. Rockets fail publicly. When a vehicle disintegrates on the pad, you smell the lie of perfection. You learn to treat failure as telemetry, raw data, not destiny. Dr. King, in his own domain, did something similar. He turned pain into data. He marched into jail cells and into dogs and into crossfire with a scientist's curiosity about human behavior. He watched what happened when disciplined love confronted systemic violence, and the results were reproducible. Moral pressure could compromise the structure of oppression. It was experiment, not spectacle. There is a symmetry here that should unsettle us. We live in an age that celebrates mechanical breakthroughs, faster processors, cheaper sensors, self-driving cars that can almost handle a city's chaos. We applaud these like they are the summits of civilization. But King was telling us something deeper. Moral systems must scale if technology is going to mean anything. You can make life technically easier for billions and still leave them morally bankrupt. What use is a colony on another planet if you take your cruelties with you? What practical use is terraforming Mars if we've not yet terraformed our own hearts? He redefined power. To the establishment of his time, power looked like force and order. He said quietly, with theological conviction and political acuity, power can be restraint. The greatest power is to accept suffering without surrendering dignity. That was his design choice. He reprogrammed the cultural CPU to accept that endurance, not retribution, could generate a different equilibrium. He made suffering an input to a moral feedback loop rather than a justification for more violence. It is the most counterintuitive of all innovations. We forget how radical that was. The mid-20th century was not a gentle era. It was the age of sirens, of angry mobs, of policemen acting like thunder. It was also the age where technology's confidence began to outpace our moral development. Computers could do sums faster than committees, yet committees still needed to learn the arithmetic of justice. King stood at that breach and said, in effect, you cannot outrun ethics. You must design them in. I have often thought about his insistence that human progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. He said it like a programmer saying, there is no default state of decency, you must code it. That phrasing resonates with me, because when people ask why I risk so much, why I put my companies through the furnace of near death in order to make something new, the answer is simple. Systems that change the future require brute persistence. You refactor code, you iterate, you accept burn. King accepted a different kind of burn. He accepted arrests, beatings, threats, the corrosive isolation that comes when your society calls you a troublemaker for telling it the truth. He paid with his body for making honesty a universal protocol. There is a loneliness to innovation that has nothing to do with money or fame. It is the solitude of being the only one who can see the error bars on a civilization's trajectory. King had that solitude and intimate knowledge that popular support often comes after the work is proven, not before. He loved a nation enough to be its critic, deeply and painfully. He demanded accountability and expected that the arc of history would respond to disciplined moral input. He believed the universe could and would bend toward justice if enough torque was applied over time. That belief is not naive. It is an engineering hypothesis. It demands testing. So when I walk these hangars at night, the rockets around me appear less like toys for escape and more like metaphors for obligation. They are physical statements that we will go further than before. But they are also a commitment. We leave Earth morally altered or we leave it morally unchanged. That is not a rhetorical flourish. It is a systems architecture problem. If you replicate your worst habits on a new world, you have only manufactured a bigger tragedy. If you take your best ethics, then you have a chance at an upward spiral. King's dream was the first iteration of that ethical firmware. He proposed that justice should be a replicable routine, one we could deploy across geographies and generations. He also taught something about attention. The movements he led required the nation to look. People saw images of police dogs, of fire hoses, of peaceful marchers met with violence. Those images were not incidental. They were a kind of brute force eye. Oh, that forced moral computation in real time. We sometimes underestimate the role of visibility in catalyzing conscience. The technology of communication amplifies injustice the way it amplifies art. King leveraged the media of his era to run an update on the nation's conscience file. He did it with sermons, speeches, and marches, and in doing so, he reduced denial by increasing exposure. There is a modern corollary to that lesson. Today's censors are ubiquitous. Cameras and data streams reveal disparity and cruelty in high resolution. But we must ask, does visibility translate to repair? Or has it become another layer of distraction? King's movement taught that showing the wound matters only if you then apply the salve of sustained moral action. Seeing alone is not repair. The civil rights legislation that followed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were the codified patches. They were not the dream's end. They were the first release. They proved that moral code could be instantiated into law, and law could change systems. Yet even laws are insufficient without cultural backing. Enforcement, vigilance, and continued iteration follow implementation. I sometimes imagine an alternate engineering team, a council that writes ethics into hardware and software as easily as engineers write firmware. Imagine if we had institutionalized moral QA, where every major technological change required tests for dignity, for fairness, for access. King might have smiled at the idea and then pointed to us with a weary look. He would say, "Fine. But who will apply the tests when no one is watching? Who will keep poking the machine until it fails in a way that reveals the bug?" He asked the nation to be that QA team. He asked citizens to be relentless debuggers of their own society. That is the piece we have forgotten in the years since his death. We folded the speech into a holiday. We made a plaque and called it progress. But a holiday is not a unit test. A plaque is not a patch. We admire the waveform of his voice, and then we go about redesigning systems that worsen inequality. Algorithms that entrench bias, economic incentives that reward extraction, and automation that promises abundance but delivers disparity. We keep telling ourselves that technology will fix these problems without acknowledging that technology inherits the values of its builders. If you train artificial intelligence on uncorrected historical data, you will reproduce the past at scale. That is not prophecy. It is a predictable failure mode. King's dream asked for proactive engineering of justice. He asked for moral iteration for constant measurement against the standard of dignity. He wanted a society that could not be fooled by the convenience of the comfortable. That line haunts me. Progress must not wait for the convenience of the comfortable. There is an ethical latency in social systems. People who are comfortable will often demand that reform be slow, because speed threatens their equilibrium. Change requires torque, and torque requires impatience. It requires people willing to be inconvenient to be the friction that causes movement. There is a shadow side to this, one I have experienced personally. Visionaries who break molds are often portrayed as selfish, reckless, or messianic. The truth is messier. Risk can be noble, or it can be narcissistic. King's risk was sacrificial. My risk is often financial and reputational. There is a distinction, but both types of risk demand a willingness to accept being misunderstood. That is a costly human tax on innovation. It requires tolerance for social loneliness. It demands friends who can separate the person from the persona, and communities that understand that being called a heretic is often the first draft of being called a prophet. This is why we must not let myth flatten the lesson. King's moral innovation was not merely rhetorical beauty. It was a methodology that could be replicated, improved, and incorporated into new institutions. If we take that seriously, then engineering and ethics are not separate disciplines. They must be fused. We should build the social equivalent of redundancy and fail-safes. We should design economies and machines that privilege human flourishing, not merely efficiency. We must imagine policy as product design, and design as political action. So here I am, beneath the cold geometry of my rockets, thinking that perhaps the greatest test of our era is not whether we can reach another world, but whether we can become the sort of species that deserves another world. We are writing firmware for a civilization with unprecedented power. Will we code humility? Will we deploy compassion as default behavior? Or will we scale our vices along with our capacities? King's dream was a call to a different project, to evolve conscience at the same rate we evolve capability. That is the moral work of our century. He modeled a new kind of power. He proved that moral courage could overcome institutional inertia. He paid for it with his life in the late 1960s, and the paradox remains: we applaud him in principle yet continue to test whether the same moral calculus can be made routine. We celebrate legislation and forget maintenance. We enact laws and fail to debug enforcement. We erect monuments to the dream and let its source code rot in complacency. And so, I sit under the lamp, and I wonder, if Martin Luther King Jr. had been an engineer in my field, what would his notebook look like? Would it contain specifications for civic algorithms? Would it sketch interfaces for empathy? Would it demand redundancy in the systems that protect voting and dignity? I think yes. I think he would have been methodical and relentless. He would also have known that no piece of technology is neutral. He would have warned that every device and policy embeds values. We have reached a junction where that warning is not an abstraction but a practical design requirement. The choices are ours to make. We can treat the dream like an artifact, something to be admired from a distance, or we can treat it like a product we are obligated to maintain, iterate, and scale. That is what I believe he meant when he insisted that human progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. He meant that it is an engineering problem of the highest order. So I asked the hangar, I asked the rockets, I asked the quiet, are we going to be the kind of species that applies the same ruthless ingenuity we apply to propulsion toward making justice reliable, scalable, and durable? Will we treat equality as an infrastructure problem rather than a seasonal sentiment?